All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa, the future of Doomer Optimism. So just to recap this series, this Doomer Optimism series at the Stoa, Jason Snyder came here, I think it was on March 12th, to do a session called Regenerative Movement, the Rise of Doomer Optimism. And this led to a series with Ashley Colby, and they had 4 sessions. The likes of Joe Norman and Vandana Shiva were here in the Doomer Optimism series at the Stoa. And this will be the last session. And after this, I believe a podcast, Doomer Optimism podcast, will emerge. And when I started the Stoa, this is exactly what I wanted to happen. The Stoa as an incubator for cool stuff to emerge. So I'm quite happy that Doomer Optimism will be continuing beyond the Stoa. So how today's going to work, I'm going to take in Jason in a moment. He's going to have a conversation with Ashley, and then we're going to have a collective conversation around, I guess, maybe after 20-30 minutes. So feel free to put your question or share in the chat anytime. I'll tag you in and you can ask your question or share your thought. If you don't want to be on YouTube, because this will be on YouTube, just indicate that and I will read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Jason, Ashley, welcome back to the Stoa. And Jason, I'll take you in.
All right, thanks everyone. It's great to be here. Appreciate you coming 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. Yeah, so what Peter said is, we've had this series, Doomer Optimism, and I don't think unless we want to go into like what that term means. I think we've dissected that, and we've had some guests on that have talked about various implications that we see. It's a pretty broad term, and I think it's meant to be kind of general, because people can relate to that in many different ways. People can see that there's really kind of these meta crises in society, and we're in a lot of trouble in different ways, but people come at that from different angles, right? People have different perspectives on that, and that's the doomer part. And the optimism part is, okay, well, we've got one life, we've got one human race, so let's see what we can do, right? And so that's like moving forward anyway. And seeing what affordances there are as well as challenges. Ashley, do you have any thoughts on the series? And before we kind of transition to what we want to do next?
Yeah, I just want to highlight some of the moments that were really cool, informative for me. Having these sort of big names who we really look up to come and discuss under the umbrella of this term that kind of just emerged spontaneously on Twitter was really cool and really fun for me, especially because we've been using this term sort of like lightly and playfully. So then having somebody like Vandana Shiva use Doomer Optimism as a term under the umbrella of her work was awesome. I really think it's important to highlight, thinking through our guests and our own perspective, the difference between Joe Norman, Chris Mage, and Vandana Shiva in terms of like the place they are in the world, their perspective, and what they focus on in terms of something positive to work toward could not be more stark, in my opinion. I mean, there's more in common, but there's something in common with them, but they're an extremely diverse group, and so are you and I, diverse from one another. And I think that's a really it's an important thing to note at the end of this series, that under the heading of things are difficult, there are issues to face, and what do we do in the face of difficulties, there can just be a lot of answers, and that's what, I don't know, sort of really exciting as someone who just wants to curate and cheerlead other people's activities. I think that was really cool and important outcome of the series for me.
Yeah, and there's a lot more people that we want to talk to, and different formats we want to experiment with. We want to continue doing interviews with interesting people, but also we want different formats like maybe debates or anti-debates. perhaps even more kind of documentary style. I mean, one, I think, common thread where we want all of this to move towards is highlighting movements, things that people are doing on the ground that, are reasons for hope. As a a doomer in good standing, what can give you, glimmers of hope in the world? And so, actually talking with these people, getting their insights, people who have real world experience, experiential knowledge. I think that's going to be a big that's going to be a big theme. But also we want, kind of the well-known, thinkers, abstract thinkers as well. And so, but I think probably most importantly, in terms of moving towards, towards this podcast is we really want it to be kind of a community involvement. And so we want a rotating cast of hosts, for example, right? So if there's people who resonate with this kind of mimetic cluster and they want to interview somebody, we can work that out. Or they want to suggest somebody for one of us to interview, we can work that out. We can have debates. For example, we've talked about a debate of like the trees and the rockets, right? Like kind of the more techno-optimist side and the more, the more Luddite side, to be very crass. Of course, it's much more complicated than that.
And I would just add, like, even within, well, certainly within people who are concerned about environmental crises, there's so much disagreement. There's so much disagreement. There's a lot, and I don't think disagreement needs to be something that we shy away from. Like, I really think it's important to have a space where disagreement and debate and discussion is generative, and so for me, I think even getting into the minutia of forms of regenerative agriculture, for example, or what the science says versus what's happening practically and what's possible, all of those things I think are worthwhile. But maybe it makes sense, Jason, to pivot now into kind of the framing questions or guiding ideas of the podcast that we have in mind.
Yeah.
Maybe we should bring in Trace to speak about it, or we should speak about it first. What do you think?
Can we introduce Trace? So actually, Trace, do you want to? So Trace is the three of us started talking about this podcast, and so we're kind of the initiators of it. Not in the longer term, not necessarily the proprietors of it, right? We want it to be a lot of people involved, a lot of people feel ownership of it. But Trace, do you want to introduce yourself and talk about how you got interested in this set of ideas and how, anything else you want to say about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Trace, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Roots Down. We work with governments to help them turn public land into food forests and pollinator habitats and other useful, productive urban spaces. It's funny because I DM'd Ashley a couple months ago and just sort of was like, are you all thinking about a podcast? Because I'm thinking about a podcast, and if you're going to do one, I don't want to step on your toes, kind of thing. And she was like, nah, not, kind of, maybe. And then we just kind of let it, kind of simmer, I guess. And then she came back to me about a month ago and was like, you know what, actually, let's talk more honestly about this. And so it's just like everything related to Doomer Optimism. It's all kind of been somewhat organic, right? It's just sort of coming out of individuals' interests. I think that I really, from my part, I'm very keen to not be identified strongly with it, in that it's not mine, it's not Jason's, it's not Ashley's. It's all of ours, whoever all of us ends up being. And so we want to try and find unique formats to highlight that decentralization. I in my business, and I like to say we're a permaculture company, not just in that we install permaculture gardens, but we also we think about business in a permaculture way. So we're always asking how can we stack functions? How can the way we do business be almost like a fractal of the type of business we do? And so I'm very keen to make this podcast where in the very format, it tells you all you need to know about this movement, whatever it is. I mean, it's so in such an infancy that calling it a movement almost is kind of it's kind of a joke, really. We need to, we need to just, plumb the depths, and I think that there's a lot of very interesting people and a lot of very interesting viewpoints across the spectrum, from Bitcoin maximalists, right, to someone who's just living completely off the land. I think that there's a lot of really interesting viewpoints we can bring into this that can start to maybe chip at the edges, kind of create maybe some edge lines of what maybe Doomer optimism is. Though I would be keen to let those edges be very porous. Let a lot of things in and out, depending on their usefulness to the whole.
I have two questions, sort of as a devil's advocate question. The first one is why does the world need another podcast? And what did we talk about in relation to this question? Because, for me, I think the critique of podcasts is it's just a lot of talking, and it's just kind of in-group people talking to one another, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my first question for both Jason and Tress, and I'll jump into. And then the second question is, we talked a little bit about the format matching what we notice of the movement itself, kind of relaxed and emergent and organic and maybe permacultural in nature, whatever, where it could be art, it could be music, it could be a guide to action, it could be theory. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that. I don't know if Jason, do you want to go?
Why a podcast? Well, I've had a podcast before, co-hosted a podcast, and after that ended, I kind of felt like, okay, I'm tired of all this talking stuff, all this sense making, and so, I kind of went in a different direction for a while. But I think that we can't get around the fact that, whatever we call ourselves, localists, bioregionalists, metamodernists, we can't get around the fact that we're connected in a global network, and if we're going to address 21st century challenges, we have to, there has to be this mode of collective intelligence. And, the Stoa, I think, is a really good format for that. And podcasts, have their limitations, but I don't know if we've exhausted the limits of, podcast format and what it can be, not so much as like these rarefied conversations, extracted conversations, more so as a way to connect with each other, a way to connect with ideas and how those ideas get implemented on the ground. And so I don't know if this needs to happen or should happen. It's just, we seem to be doing it. That's what we're doing. And so it's happening. I don't, whether,
Trace, do you have it? Sorry, go ahead.
Knows, right?
Yeah. I mean, also there's just these path dependencies that just exist in the world. It's like, hey, we're all being friends. We're on the internet. Let's make a podcast. But I also think critically interrogating that might help us to think, how to push the boundaries of what a podcast is and to add something to the ether that is useful. Trace, do you have anything on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you about the path dependency. It'd be like asking in the in the 19th century, why write a novel, right? Because it's an incredibly useful and popular vehicle for ideas and interrogating ideas. And so that's it for me. I mean, I just think it's a very popular medium. It's akin to sitting around a kitchen table and chatting over dinner. You get to learn a lot about people. It's an incredibly useful tool for a reason to introduce yourself to strangers, it'd be like, hey, be on my podcast, I think for all those reasons, that's why. Does the world need another podcast? Absolutely not. But no, you could argue the world doesn't need another movement either. What is the purpose of all of this? I don't know. We've all sort of emergently found each other and are finding some joy in this connection. And I think we, owe it to each other and owe it to whoever might find us in the future to explore that. And a podcast is a really useful, maypole, right, for us all to twirl around.
Yeah,
basically.
right. And for me, I would just echo that sentiment. For me, I set my goals really low and achievable. And if the goal is just to like make closer friends with you guys and everyone who we're talking with in a longer form on Twitter, who I really enjoy the relationships that are being built. That's achievable and already happening, and would be a great format for that. And also, there's also something to podcasts where listening in with people who are building friendships over time is just really fun. It just feels like you're part of the club, or you're hearing their banter and relationship, which is just like, I actually think there's a pretty important psychological side to the Doomer optimism thing in general, which is, how do we model happy and healthy psychological ways of being, as opposed to stress or depression or anxiety. But I would also say that I think to the second question I posed, we talked a little bit about the urgency that we feel toward doing anything that we can to advance or lift up cool emergent solutions. I mean, I think half the time I'm fighting with people on Twitter, I'm just basically saying, like, if you just saw or knew some of the people that I have interacted with, you would be as hopeful as I am. But I want to make the people who are experimenting on the ground more legible. I want to help them. I want to lift up their examples. And I think the feeling of urgency, like we have to do something, it could be a nice platform for that, feeling like we're, even Trace, your work, how many people know about it, and as a model that could be used in cities across the US. Any of these kinds of models, I think this is like the ideal format for this Cosmo-localism. Talk about your model, talk about action steps, talk about what your successes and failures, and then other people can, learn from that and draw from it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think a lot about the idea of the dandelion insurgency, and I kind of think about what could be possible with this podcast is simply, if each individual is doing something cool, if we can hold up that dandelion and then just blow it out there, and just let those seeds land where they will, I think that will do a lot for the sort of decentralized nodes that we're talking about. I mean, I don't know. The last year has been absolutely magnificent for me, as far as like I've been on Twitter for almost 10 years, and never knew how to use it until like the last 6 or 7 months, and now I feel like it's an indispensable part of my community. And it's, I think that we need to kind of have some, like I said, I think the metaphor I can use is the maypole. Like it's something we stick in the ground, and then we can all take our own ribbons and make our own kind of braid around it. But beyond that, I mean, I don't know, maybe in a year it will have served its useful life, and we set it aside and people can listen to it later, and it doesn't have much usefulness beyond that. It's just a tool for now. But if it can help connect everybody, even if it's connecting, adjacent to the main connections, that still is a, what do they call it? I don't know, it's a scaffolding device, basically. It's a way of kind of scaffolding ideas and connecting us all to each other.
I'm curious, Peter, you are in kind of an OG in the space, in the podcasting and kind of digital community space. I'm curious to get your input about what we're talking about, and what insights you might have or ideas you might have for us.
Yeah. I was very, like, when I started the Stoa, I had a podcast before it. And when I started the Stoa, I really didn't want to call it a podcast. So I called it a communal podcast sometimes, or digital campfire, because I didn't want to limit it to that kind of, the scripts and the frameworks of a podcast. And when I was hearing you, Jason, talk about like the potential of all the stuff that might emerge from this experiment, it sounds a little bit more that beyond the scope of what a podcast, people understand a podcast to be. And something cool that's emerging at the Stoa, and I'll mention this and I'll tie it into what I think could emerge at the Doomer Optimism podcast. So we're doing this what's called basically a course or an anti-course or something in November called Beyond Self-Discipline. It's going to be like a mastermind group with all this cool stuff. I'm super excited about it. And I realized like this whole adventure of doing the Stoa was sort of like an R&D lab for this course to exist now. And it's like, wow, so this is not really still not a podcast. I don't know what it is, but this, thanks to whatever we're doing here, this thing emerged. And I was just thinking before the session even started, like, wouldn't it be so fucking cool to have like a Doomer Optimism course or some kind of accountability group to just like have exit strategies to get out of your current lifestyle into a new lifestyle? Because a lot of people don't know where to begin. So yeah, those are just my general thoughts. And for me, there's a longing. I think there's a collective longing for, help in this area. I'm wondering if this experiment could be of service towards that.
I'll tell you, Peter, I think that the second half of what you said was very beautiful, because I think that it was some of the animus behind us getting together on this in the first place was this sense of like, more and more people every day are coming to this awareness of like, we're really in a bad way as a species. And then the next question is always, what can I do? Like, I'm locked in this system. How can I get out of it? And for many of us, we're in our daily lives, our immediate circle, we're in many cases the oddball, the only one or one of the few who are actually like keenly feeling this. And so we can feel zero support in our immediate group. And that's why we've all turned to Twitter and we're connecting with one another. So there might be something really to that, of like starting to be like, okay, these are concrete steps. These are people you can connect to. This is sort of a matrix of resources that are available to you to help step out of the system incrementally until you're fully free of it, and the more of us that are free of it, the less the system has control, right? And the more that it has to start to account for this large group of people that are stepping out of it. And in some respects, it makes it even more destabilizing, because it would be people of all walks of life, all over the world, and certainly all over the country. It's not like it's one group in Atlanta, Georgia, and you can just stamp them out, right? It's like, no, it's like small groups all over the place. It's very difficult to manage that for big centralized systems. And I think that was really beautiful. Thank you for saying that, Peter. I think it's a really keen insight into where this could go incrementally.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about your Loconomy project, and it seems like, if not tied in directly with that, there's something analogous there, where, and someone just asked on the chat, Nathan, how much of a podcast how much will this just be a how-to type talks? I think it will be like, hey, let's find each other. Like, a few of us found each other on Twitter, but through the podcast, and I know various folks have started meeting each other in real life. Let's have some how-to type talks. Like, how do you actually start, or an organization like Tress has in the city to do urban permaculture. I think it'll be all of the above. How do you find each other? How do you perhaps relocate eventually if you want to be close to each other? I mean, I really want this to be kind of like a community forum that actually manifests in the real world. Ashley, do you want to, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, basically the Loconomy idea, it really is a similar thing. It's basically, how do we discover other people who are selling things locally, and just start buying from them. But basically, these decentralized, these sets of people who are, few and far between. How do we use the internet, which, I'm a Luddite in general, but how do you use the internet to as a tool to connect, to discover one another? And then I imagine, going off Peter's comment, what if it became this place where you had more and more sort of side project offshoots? Joe Norman spun up a localist Discord just on a lark, when people were saying we should all get together and have some sort of Discord. You have a Discord, you have a wiki, you have a course. People who work in permaculture get into their own little group and start sharing information with more and more granularity. Like, basically, I think we have so far to go to get to whatever it is that we're looking for. I mean, in general, I use energy as my guiding principle, some sort of low carbon life, which has all other sorts of positive side effects, but there's just a lot of parts that need to be redone. I mean, education, transportation, agriculture, food systems, community, family, health, wellness, like, you know, anything that you're interested in, there's going to be a job for you to start working on how to figure out where we're going next. So I think a lot of times people see these things and they think like, oh, permaculture gardens or chickens, like that's just silly little time stuff. But I think my vision is just in this larger network, and it's a million tiny pieces that add up into something much more significant, and not scale up and become everything. But Jason was just talking about a sort of decentralized horizontal scale.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say broad scale. You know, I kind of, what came to my mind, I don't know if anyone has listened to the Survival podcast by Jack Spirko. You know, he's kind of like a prepper kind of guy, but he's also interested in permaculture. But one thing I think he does really well that we can kind of take from is that he does a lot of how-to episodes. You know, like somebody mentioned, how to sell vegetables from your garden, or how do you start, a new kind of business, or how do you, whatever it is, how do you?
Yeah, I mean, I have the student groups that come to Uruguay, for example. What are the details of how that all works out? How do I work with the farmers to bring the students? Who gets paid what, and how much time does it take? And how do you seek out partners and all that kind of stuff? Yeah.
Right. And so we want to interview people or have discussions with people who have a lot of this practical knowledge to share. And also for people who are like part of the community and are interested in this stuff, if you have knowledge to share, I also want it to be like where you feel comfortable reaching out to us saying, hey, I want to host a podcast talking about this knowledge that I have that I can share with people. And can you please kind of interrogate me or ask me questions as I laid out, or if I want to interview somebody else who I know is just kind of, some kind of, autodidact, brilliant person that can teach us a lot of things. Maybe we can go ahead and open it up to the audience. And I'm curious, how you've related to this kind of memeplex called Doomer Optimism, and or this series, and what would you like to see in terms of how this podcast, or whatever we're calling it, would evolve? How would it be of service? How would it be useful for you, and in your mind, of service to life, and transitioning to to a new a new system state that can take us into the future?
Yeah, so why don't we bring Peter back in to help moderate some of the comments, if you would.
Sounds good. So yeah, just put anything in the chat, share. If you want to raise your hand, I can pick on you as well. But Nicholas, you had to share just now, if you'd like to unmute yourself and share with the group.
Hello, my brethren and my sisters. Anyway, so I thought it'd be might be beneficial, because obviously we're in this space in media, journalism, etc. To think about this a little bit more than just one podcast. I think we all kind of have seen the podcast space kind of hit its threshold of certain things, of interviews. I recently just interviewed Ashley. But then as well, we're in the same boat of trying to see what's next. And we actually, in next month, most likely, we also bought our tickets. I was going to email Jason and Ashley, but we're coming down to Jason's farm to film a little bit of a short film in this kind of regard. So to get a little bit more professional, like camera work, some real like cinematic quality of the things that can kind of bring this to the fold. Now, that's my specialty and that's my niche thing, but I think every single one of us has that, kind of intangible thing that they can bring to this. So again, to see this as like more of a YouTube collective channel, but obviously you'll have to have moderators, you'll have to have people running it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the entire venture, I think, is more of to think about, it is ripe for digital media. Everyone's in it. right now the bad guys, if you want to say anything, are winning. So let's kind of, bring ourselves up, and anyone can join in. And lastly, since I'm talking, I guess right now, is one thing I saw you guys kind of parsing out, and Jason, I don't want to pick on you, but you just said like trees versus rockets. But I think one of the things that brought me into this, and what brings a lot of people into this, is the communicative nature of both and all kind of viewpoints, and no one is kind of like shamed or put away. And so like one of the things that kind of does is put into trees and rockets, Luddites, techno-optimists, Doomer optimists. But one of the things I think that is beneficial for this group of people that sets it apart is the connection of the two. All of us know that the Doomers and the optimists alone are not enough, but there is some type of threading the needle between the two, that if you have a connection or conjunction or type of intention, that I think that can be more beneficial. So those are just my two things, is to think of this more of as a way bigger than a podcast, way bigger, because you guys are at the thing of literally changing the world possibly for the next century if you really do it right. You don't take this lightly. But also, don't forsake yourselves into having to work for this. You know what I mean? Do it as much as you can, and then also try to be an intention rather than separate extremes. So that's my thing.
Thank you, Nicholas. That was so good. I just want to briefly respond that to me, I think probably one of the most important skills that I keep talking about, it's not planting trees or having a garden or anything else. It is building relationships in a healthy way. I think we're just losing that so much. And I would love for this space to be a place where we model debate and discussion. I mean, among people who disagree, but finding common ground in a longer form. On Twitter, it always just goes to the maximalist position immediately. You make your point, somebody challenges it, so you have to go even further to the end of your point to defend it, when usually, almost always, the answer is some mixture, some dualism, something in between. So I appreciate that point a lot. And I hope, I think, I don't know, maybe Evan, we can get into Evan's question next, because it touches on that too.
Just real quick, a term came to mind in terms of the name of the podcast. You're saying the Doomer Optimist podcast, maybe the Doomer Optimist Collective. And then that kind of gives space for beyond a podcast.
I like that.
I also really like what you're saying, Nicholas. I mean, I have my own biases or viewpoints, if you want to put it, but I'm also a proponent of mimetic mediation, as well as Peter Limberg, who came up with the term. And so, figuring out how to communicate and find signal in the noise, and synthesize perspectives, I think is our only chance. So great comment. I'm totally with you.
Did you have something to share, Trez, before I take in Evan?
No. I think Jason actually covered it. We'll move on because you got a couple hands up, I think.
Cool. Evan?
Yeah, so Ashley, as you noticed, my question or comment is sort of very related to what was just being discussed. I guess so. From my perspective, I've kind of been engaged mainly in looking into researching, thinking about, et cetera, the sort of what I think of as the lost social technology of actually forming enduring local connections and bonds, and coordinating with people local to you to do things together in a way that's not characteristic of our current individualist atomized culture. Like, I believe we used to have such social technologies. I kind of think that we don't, and that we just maybe have some memories or pale shadows of it culturally. And so it's always seemed like it's a little bit missing from the Doomer Optimism space to me, this idea that even if you get a bunch of people and you have them living in the same local area and they're doing all the cool Doomer Optimist, regenerative ag, like Luddite things, I've been a part of communities that are some sort of approximation of that before, and they always fall apart due to the fact that we don't really know how to invest in long-term relationships outside of the context of a family, like children or spouse or somebody who you're connected to through blood or marriage. And we need to recover that, I think, in order to have this localist Doomer optimism sort of thing actually work, And so I'm curious if you guys are interested in potentially hosting some discussions along those lines on the podcast. I'd be super interested in participating, or just how you guys feel about that sort of aspect of the problem space.
I mean, I'm definitely interested, Evan. I think like, I mean, I have come to this project mostly interested in action, right? So I've been thinking about the world ending for 20 darn years. I'm sick of thinking about it, sick of talking about it. I just want to talk. If we're going to talk, I want to talk about the solutions. I want to talk to cool people doing cool stuff and how that they're affecting it at the local level. I think someone posted earlier about something that Joe Norman said about, we need to focus on things that don't scale. And I think that I love that concept of just like, and that's what we're doing here at Roots Down. And I'm trying not to do a plug here, but like our concepts are supposed to be applied at the hyper local level. So it's not going to be applied in the same way in Chattanooga as it is here in Atlanta. It's not going to be applied certainly in Portland, Oregon, as the same way it is here in Atlanta. The general rubric fits, right? But it has to be applied locally. People at the local level have to understand how to do it, and they have to have those local relationships. Otherwise, we're no different than Amazon, where it's just another extractive company, right? And I think that this is what I want to kind of go back. I think it was Nicholas said something, what he was talking about a little bit, because I think that in the way we structure this, it is a very interesting skunk works for a decentralized movement in general, right? Is that like, if we're going to talk about this as a collective, which this is always my thing, I always try and take things to the maximal level, like this, I love these kind of thoughts experiments. But like the idea is like, if this is going to be something that's decentralized and it's across the globe even, how do we keep it from collapsing? And I think that the idea is that it has to have very strong foundational elements in local communities, which means, how do we relate to each other again? I personally live in a very suburban area, like kind of a classic 60s suburban area. And COVID was a real opportunity for everyone to get outside and start being like more neighborly, and start like, me and my wife would just sit in the side yard and drink a beer in our lawn chairs, and all the neighbors are walking by, and we just have all these conversations like, holy cow, you live 3 doors down from me, I didn't know, like. And now we're, those relationships are starting to form and starting to hold even after COVID, or after the first 3 waves of COVID. But like, I want to see this like really translate to that local level, translate to action, translate to people transitioning from the doomer to the optimist side faster than the 20 years it's taken me to kind of get to that spot. I want to help kind of midwife that in a little bit through these types of experiences and through this type of a collective, if that's what we're going to call it.
Yeah, I know probably Jason has a comment on this too, because I know your background is in a commune, and I think in general, we do a lot of social experimentation in these kinds of circles or alternative movements or whatever. And I think it's quite important to learn from successful social technologies, as you call them, Evan. When the student groups come to Uruguay, I'm trying to teach them about like agroecology and the practices of how they're doing agriculture in this place. And what the students always grasp onto is actually what's happening socially when we're there. They're looking at how the kids are running around, how the parents are relating to the kids while also doing work, how the neighbors come to help, how the person who knows how to do earth building shows up, but then they explain how they owe him a favor later, and how this sort of mutual aid works. That social aspect, where it's successful, I think it's so important to talk about the minutia of that. And I know Jason has some stories about talking with his neighbors too, and relating to them. So I think, it's probably the underlying substrate of any kind of practical movement is you've really got to nail those social relations and talk about what's succeeding and what has failed in the past, and learning from past utopian communal models where, okay, they're trying to change too much too quickly, and we don't have the skills to do the governance, and et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, Evan, what you were talking, I mean, so one term that came to mind, I think you're referring to, is like this kind of psychotechnologies, right? Or these kind of relational technologies, right? And you said we've kind of lost these technologies. I mean, I think what you're referring to is kind of tradition, right? And our kind of tenuous in modernity, our kind of tenuous relationship with tradition, many of us. And I think that the future is going to have to be a hybrid where we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of family. Like, I think we need to recover intergenerational families. We need to recover kind of traditional, neighborly kind of values. Like here in Southern Appalachia, there's a tradition of, everyone is kind of pro private property ownership, but there's a strong culture of mutual aid here, right? And it still exists, not as strong as it used to be, but so for me, it's like, okay, if I understand the traditions of my area, I can kind of tap into that and help to revive them and perhaps contribute to, a new formulation of it using, some of these, kind of cutting edge relational technologies, whatever it could be, whether we do these workshops or some kind of meditative or
Storytelling.
Storytelling.
Just telling stories about relating with people in ways that have been successful.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Storytelling. And so I think that we're a little bit more hardened from the 1970s back to the land movement. I mean, that's, you mentioned I'm from a commune. I'm not personally from a commune, but my parents met on a commune, and so I'm very familiar with that milieu and, and very aware that it all kind of fell apart, but some of them didn't, right? So there's a book that I'm starting to read now by Brian Donahue. It's called Reclaiming the Commons. And it's about in some New England suburb, I think outside of Boston or something, where for the last 30 years they've had this kind of like neighborhood commons where you have this kind of hybrid of common land, but also people have their own places. It's a suburb basically, and all of these different social forms of organization kind of emerge that are tied to the land, tied to people's sustenance, tied to their daily lives, and still going and it's successful. Right. And so I think we can learn from, what did survive from these previous experiments, but also bring in these new cutting edge ideas that come from the integral scene, the meta-modern scene. We're not alone, isolated. We don't have to be. And I think we should use that to our advantage.
Any follow-up, Evan?
Yeah, I mean, I really love what everybody was said, and I just want to say, Ashley, that you're clearly doing something right. Like some of the descriptions you've shared on Twitter randomly about the sort of way that your thing that you're doing is integrated with the broader local scene, whether that's based on an implicit or explicit understanding. That's the sort of thing that I'm really interested in exploring more of, because I've experienced times where there's like a sense of isolation from the more normal groups around you. And then also where there's a sense, separately, of like the sense of the tyranny of structurelessness when you get the sort of like collectivist, leaderless, non-hierarchical type thing, because that sort of ignores the way that humans naturally form hierarchy. And yeah, I'm just super interested in exploring this space as it applies to localism. So I'll try and follow up with you guys. So thank you very much for the answers.
I would just briefly say that I think that my project in Uruguay works well because people are used to working together. And in the US, I imagine people would be like, what do you want out of this? And, what do you want out of me? In a very individualist or, instrumental way of relating. So I think part of my success has been, I've got really welcome partners who are skilled at this, but it's not all me, but yes, I appreciate that. Thanks.
And I'll just add one last thing. I think that when it comes to this, we need to have a lot of imagination, and we need a lot of different viewpoints, because I don't think that, basically we've got like this long list of historical jackets, right? And we just keep trying on jackets. I don't think the back to the land movement of the 70s is quite right. I don't think that the Sooners and the land grabs of the mid 19th century are quite right. But we need to find a path forward that's not necessarily, that may be drawing from all these different experiences and parallels in the past, but the circumstances are completely different now. I think that one of the key things that I've noticed, and I may be wildly off base because this is not my a course of study for me, but it seems that oftentimes the intentional part of intentional communities is in fact the problem, right? Is that the goal should be for the community to still be here next generation in whatever format it takes in that generation. And it should have the fluidity to kind of maintain its general form. But when it's very rigid in, there's usually some sort of animating impulse that brought everyone together. In the colonies, many cases it was religion, right? They came over, and religion was the thing that brought them together. In the 19th century, it was largely capitalism, right? It was largely just like, there's all this free land, and I'm going to go take it, and I'm going to go make a living off of this, right? And that's what forced people into kind of building communities around those things. But many of those like old organizing principles just are not applicable in the ways that they used to be. Certainly capitalism isn't. Capitalism has become more of an atomizing force than one that kind of brings people together. So, the question is, what are new organizing forces? What are other ways we can get those groups together and then keep them together, even if they change and shift and morph into different things as they go along?
Jason, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think we should bring someone else in.
Sean, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I resonate with a lot of what's been said here, and I wanted to just introduce myself. I'm coming here as, in part, an observer of something that I've kind of seen on the peripheries of Twitter. I'm not terribly active on the website, but have seen, the Doomer Optimism stuff going around, and as well as something of an emissary of the sort of older tradition that was being mentioned earlier. I'm involved in several sort of Catholic ecological organizations, Tradiste, Catholic Social Action. I'm also a member of the Catholic Worker Movement. I'm living here in a Catholic Worker House, if anyone's familiar with it. And I just wanted to just sort of introduce myself and what we're working on as something that I'd really love to see some synergy between. In terms of our politics, we're particularly inspired by the sort of agrarian populism of Chris Smage, and I'll be interviewing him soon for my podcast, and we've really enjoyed being in touch with him and hope to do so more. We're very particularly inspired by his vision, which is the fact that he was interviewed on the Stoa is what brought me into seeing this on my radar in the first place. And so when you mentioned, the sort of decentralized networks of these intentional communities, that's something that we're very interested in, and that we have been doing in some ways, particularly from a Catholic angle, for sort of our brief history working together, trying to promote Catholic worker houses in different places, in parish communities, those sorts of network. And I recognize that not everyone necessarily shares that particular spiritual lens in how they're approaching Doomer optimism, broadly speaking. But definitely, I think there's a lot of overlap there. And I just want to kind of introduce what we're doing and ask in what ways there can be some synergy between that coming from different corners. Because I would say that there's a lot of Catholics, a lot of maybe sort of traditional but radical Christians who hold their faith, their values very deeply, but are also very interested in social justice and in the sort of problems facing civilization, as we've discussed here, that I think could definitely be a really valuable connection for a lot of those here.
I think we could start by, I would love to have you and anybody else associated with this, with this organization or movement on the Doomer Optimist Collective to talk about it and discuss and talk about what you guys are doing. I think that would be a good place to start. I'd be really into that.
I would too. I also I think in general, I've kind of graduated from I guess my college liberal indoctrination that told me anything that's religious is backwards, etc. I'm just saying the quiet part out loud. That's basically what they tell you. You don't learn this religious stuff that's too off the grid or whatever. And I think I'm just I'm so curious and interested in, I seem to find myself agreeing with people who are deeply religious very often lately. And somebody was also saying recently on Twitter that churches make, people were saying, you know, how do we find deep community? Somebody said, have you tried joining a church? And it's like such a silly but obvious thing to say. And I'm just more and more interested in, like, what is the church like now? What is your experience of it? Obviously, there are a huge diversity of what the church is, and you know, subgroups within different religions. But I'm super interested in thinking of the church as a community, as a traditional structure that works in a certain way to bring people together toward a common good. And I think there's something really important there. I would also just add this little story. When I met these church-going people in Uruguay, and I had been to so many different, you know, I guess like meetups with lefty environmentalist types. And it's like, I mean, I'm painting with broad strokes here, but you know, nobody remembers to bring food to eat, or nobody's keeping track of the time. And it's like sort of disorganized. And when I go to this church event, it's like everybody's brought food, everybody's taking care of each other's kids. You know, people have this sort of built in, and this is just my one experience, sense of how community works well, and are practiced in it, right? You know, it's not something new that they're trying to create from scratch. It's something that's, you know, been ongoing. So anyways, I'm just extremely curious about all the different ways in which we can learn from already existing or traditional institutions to you know, to glean whatever we can.
Yeah, I'm curious to trade notes. I used to be very religious as well. I used to be part of the Baha'i faith, and we were all about community, you know, kind of community development. You know, basically what we're doing now, talking about as Doomer Optimists, but from a religious lens. And I also, you know, ran up against what I perceived as some limitations of that model. And so I would love to trade notes and maybe get over some of my hangover from those days. It'd be very interesting for me.
Definitely. Well, yeah, it would be, I would absolutely love to come on and have a full conversation about it. And likewise, I'd be particularly interested in, there's two podcasts that we run. The Tradiste podcast is what I run. And then Tim Wainwright, close friend of mine, he runs the Catholic Social Action sort of network. And he has a podcast called the Solidarity Policy Podcast. It's in essence sort of Smagian politics with a Catholic lens, he I'm sure would be interested as well in talking to some of the Doomer Optimism gang. So yeah, I think there's a lot of fruitful room for conversation there.
Flavius, you had a question or comment?
Thank you. No, thanks for the connection. I just was telling, I just wrote in the chat that I'm envisioning this augmented reality live role-playing game. And, as a way of kind of a good way of, because I think that the self are the whole idea, the whole game, a self competition kind of way, kind of gets in the way of creating new social technologies to network in a new way. So I think we can, if we can kind of make a trick to, instead of I'm being Flavius, being me, and doing this, I'm someone else. I create an avatar. I create like another layer, and I get a function from the game, and from there, I think we can learn so much about what we need to learn. I think humanity is going in that direction of going beyond that one identity again, kind of, because now it's like your identity gets normally it's all very centralized and all very public in the same sphere. Even if you try not to, it gets connected. And I think we need to find tools and gamifying and kind of tools to. This could be very helpful for what I think we are trying to do, which is find a new social technology that allows us to connect in more efficient ways and not competitive ways.
I'll let Trace or Jason go first, but I have a couple of thoughts that come up for that. Either of you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely interested in learning more about that as a potential project. Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, I think we just need to be massively creative. Like we need to, they're really, they're in times of crisis, especially systemic crises like this, like you really kind of, you need to just throw stuff against the wall and see what sticks, because we don't really have time to debate endlessly about what will work in theory. We need to just really just find things that will fit. So, if there's a way for us to like, I mean, the kind of augmented reality concept of like kind of tossing off, our physical selves in a way, like tossing off these kind of constraints we're in to imagine new worlds. It can't hurt. It certainly can't hurt.
I would
Jason.
just add that it can't hurt, but you have to be a little bit careful to keep yourself grounded in these physical communities. I think we've all become a little bit disembodied through COVID. I don't know. In some ways, I'm pushing back a little bit. I think we've kind of, we all kind of took refuge in social media and our avatars and these different identities that we're projecting onto the world. And I think that's cool. I mean, I'm all about exploring the sense of self and how it changes and ecology of subselves and all of that. But I think that we need, we also need to explore how those take purchase in the world, right? How they take purchase in how we meet our basic necessities of life, especially if, systems that we relied upon start breaking down, et cetera, et cetera. How do we come together? And if it enables that, then I think that's a really cool idea.
Yeah, I would echo that, Jason. The whole everything tech, I'm like just so skeptical of immediately. That's like my first thing is like, I don't know about this. I got to hear more. So that's my general perspective. But I also am like, I open to whatever. Two things come to mind. Somebody mentioned this game that like is basically Doomer Optimism. I think it was a Japanese creator. I don't remember the name of it. Maybe one of you do, but it was basically like a cooperative end of the world collapse game. And the more you work together with other people, then the Death Stranding, there we go. The more your like your little area is successful. I love that. Although again, like don't spend your whole life in the game. You're gonna have to. I think there's almost something like, I think of comedians a lot where they say like, I can't come up with any new jokes unless I like spend enough time out in the world to make fun of things. So you have to like have enough time in the actual world that's messy to inform your experiences, your art, your creativity, your digital world. The other thing that comes to mind is I know that a lot of people have anonymous accounts on Twitter. And I do think that we're kind of in the world where things can be, difficult to be with your real name for various censorship reasons. So I think that's also something to think about. I'm a part of several not secret, but invite only Discord chats where most of the people are anonymous and people are free to discuss things in this alternative world where they're not themselves. I think there is something to that, almost like anonymous writers collectives of the past. And I think, using technology as a way to anonymize yourself, to be more free to share information is also something I'm interested in exploring. Is Nicholas still here? I wanted to give him a chance to respond because I know he had something to say on this topic.
Go ahead, Nicholas.
Just
Perhaps
real
we'll
quick, Peter.
squeeze
Thank
in,
you.
yeah, 10 more minutes and we'll close.
Okay, cool. I just thought of a heuristic kind of to consider again with all this is maybe some layering. I mean, because scaling might not be the best word that we've kind of been throwing around. And maybe we need every layer. You know, we need the most at the end, world building and VR and AR. But at the same time, it almost is it's all just for naught if it's not connected. I mean, this is really something that like Wendell Berry has like almost incepted into my mind with everything. Is like, what use is it? And so if it's not connected, like I was just thinking, for instance, one example, and this is very anecdotal and very off the top, so bear with me. But like, for instance, like chopping wood. Like if someone's like never chopped wood before, like maybe you could have like an AR, VR of like actually like looking and doing it, or how to make the axe, like all that kind of stuff. But then at the same time, you could just have a video of someone else chopping it, or you could have your neighbor just come over and show you. So like, but at the same time, it could just be we need to talk very specifically and use language and semantics, I guess you could say, about where we are talking about it. And I think that maybe that would be beneficial in some of these things to connect from a very high tech to a very Luddite, you know, whatever. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Nicholas. So how about, I'll make some maybe closing thoughts that conclude the series, and just tag in Ashley, Jason, and Trez so you guys can do some concluding thoughts, and then we'll close out. Yeah, so on my end, I just want to say it was really cool. Like, I was talking to Jason about this a couple of months ago, how sort of accused my languaging and the mimetic tribe formed on Twitter around the strange attractor Doomer Optimism. And now it seems like the next logical move is that this mimetic tribe is going to become an embodied tribe in this digital commune or collective or whatever it is that's going to be deeply connected to what's happening on the local ground. So I'm really excited to see this emerge. And if you need my help or the Stoa's help, just reach out, and I'm happy to give any feedback as I can. And yeah, thank you so much for using the Stoa and being here for the last 5 sessions. It was quite a treat for everyone here. So I'll tag anyone in to share some final thoughts here at the Stoa Doomer Optimism series.
I just want to say thank you so much to Peter. It was just so thoughtful of you, and you're obviously very intuitive to pick up that there's this thing that's nascent, and to sort of be a sandbox for us to play in and figure out who we are was so nice, and on your platform. So I loved that, and I just want to express my appreciation at the end of our session.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, Peter. I think you're kind of like the king of digital collectives, and so it's a real honor to be on and to be given so many sessions. And we'll definitely be tapping you, and hopefully we can collaborate in the future with the Stoa. And it seems like there's a lot of cross fertilization going on. We talked about the sense making web a couple of years ago, and at that time it was just a bunch of podcasts where we like went on each other's podcasts, and that was a very kind of like 1.0 version. And so hopefully the new kind of more layered, enhanced sense making web and embodied sense making web can arise. So yeah, I look forward to all our interactions in the future.
And I'll just add, we have recorded the first episode. We're in the process of figuring out how we're going to get that online and in what format. So I would just ask anyone who's interested, like we're very open to ideas. So if you have people you'd want us to be interviewed, if you in fact want to interview somebody yourself, we're very open to the format. We're open to discussions on Twitter about what this all could mean. We may be putting up some information here shortly, even to get some crowdsourced opinions on about what format you want to see us send this out in. And so yeah, just pay attention to Twitter and these normal spaces, and help us help us get this going, because we only have a little bit of the knowledge required to get it started, and we're going to need everyone else's help to get it across the finish line.
All Right, beautiful. So I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but Ashley, Jason, Trey, thank you so much for coming today and having the series here at the Stoa. I'll put all the information on the show notes when we launch the video on YouTube. And our next session at the Stoa is tomorrow, related to some of the stuff talked about today, collective intelligence. John Thompson from Circling Europe is going to come in and deliver an experiment. He's been experimenting wildly with this collective intelligence stuff, and he says it's like a direct contact with grace. I think that's how he worded it. So that's going to be here at the Stoa tomorrow, 12 p.m. Eastern time. So that being said, we'll close out with the Doomer Optimism theme song from Cosmo-localism. So again, everyone, thanks for coming to the Stoa today.